very important that we come together this afternoon looking at a very important situation of stigma, community responses on albinism. The confusion of whether persons with albinism are disabled or not, which was subsequently clarified by the UNCRTB, also perpetuates discrimination, which is based mainly on terminology. Word, for example, like you've heard a lot that in South Africa, people with albinism have certain terminology. Inkawu, which is a monkey, Ishaywa, which is a curse, Leswafe, and the Deputy Minister just stressed on the point that we're trying to go into all the ethnic groups to say, let's find an appropriate name, how to call people with albinism, which leads us to stigma and negative responses from communities towards persons with albinism. Much of the social discrimination against people with albinism stems out from the communities. And why the communities? The communities lack education. As we go about, even us persons with albinism, we lack education. Some of us found very late, why are we white in a black community? Why am I white and I'm not as white as white people? And my parents are not having the same skin of lacking of pigmentation. The communication, the people with albinism lack the limited knowledge on genetics. Am I not loud enough? Okay. We lacking our genetic inheritance, which came up in a number of papers this afternoon. Therefore, it has created traditional myths and superstitions which we have to lead to killings of persons with albinism. In African countries, therefore, we are going to look at the stigma that we have in our communities. Let me start by saying this afternoon, we're going to look at the family members who don't have albinism. And our families have fought our fights from kindergarten, right up to our marriages, right up to the workplace where you find people will be tiptoeing after you and calling you names, even if they are educated. And our families now, it is the time that when I think that from this conference, we are going to go out very much strengthened to say, we know and we are taking this journey that we are going to educate and educate and educate. Without much ado, can I ask my panelists to come up? The first panelist is Kelly N. She is a very independent researcher. Let's hear what she's saying this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I want to start by just saying that today we've seen the power of misinformation, fear, and discrimination in the minds of people in the United States. And our call to action today is part of a large global problem. So I hope that we can unite and learn from one another, and also learn to forgive one another. And so today I'm going to speak about the Ibegwa, or the Children of the Moon of Gunayala, Panama. And in this photo, it's a painting of ancient tradition of Gunas with albinism who are shooting at the monster eating a moon during a lunar eclipse. I'll speak a little bit about this later, but just remember it. Formerly, I've written about the issues pertaining to people with albinism in Uganda and how they fit under international, national, and regional laws. But today what I want to do is I want to present a case study I want to talk about changing stigma and community responses to albinism as it happened in Panama, Central America. And my purpose is not a prescriptive one. While my paper does provide several recommendations, today what I want to do is I want to provide this story in this case study, so hopefully you all can go back to your communities and think about how can this inform our work? How can this uplift and support all the amazing work that's already being done? And so today what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about the Guna themselves, and then speak to the history, how they have conquered the discrimination and oppression that they used to have for people with albinism, and how they currently live within a society that is not only inclusive of people with albinism, but also has positive stereotypes associated with the condition. And then I'll, time permitting, provide a few takeaways and highlight a few possible recommendations. So, probably no one can read that. It says, quote, "What is needed is a radical increase in social and political will." This is by Don Sawatsky of Under the Same Sun in Tanzania. And what I really like about this quote, when I asked him, what are some of the main barriers you all are facing, is that it has this element of collective responsibility, that both people with albinism and people without albinism need to come together in order to see the value of people within our communities who have the condition. And so I want to take us to a trip across the world to Panama, Central America. This is right before Colombia. And the Guna people live within a sub-autonomous state called Gunayala. It's on the islands of the Caribbean side. And within Gunayala, you have approximately 35,000 people who are living within 51 communities on 36 islands. Most of these are very condensed populations. Also, what's important is their economy. Their economy is mostly agricultural or fishing, and some tourism as well. And this is particularly important, as we probably all know, because they're on the equator, and so that means they spend a good deal of time outside. And also, there's limited resources. The majority of Guna people are under the International Poverty Index, and there's also limited access to medical educational resources. But most significantly is the rate of albinism, which is estimated to be about 1 in 159 people have albinism. And this has a lot of connotations for how they're accepted within their societies. So what I've done within my report is I've divided up the timeline of how albinism is understood, and there were 3 really significant markers within their history. The first one is a time, in ancient times, people with albinism were set apart. According to their oral traditions, when man was first created, there were several human beings on earth. One of them had albinism, but this was no ordinary man. This was a child of the moon, or Ibegwa. And this person had certain powers. It was believed that all people of the moon, Ibegwa, were special. Their actual lives were in the heavens. But unfortunately, that meant that they were very much not allowed to participate in everyday society. Many were killed at birth with this belief that it was benevolent to allow them to go back to their home. They weren't allowed to participate in normal economic activities because they were so special they needed to be handled with care. And they also weren't allowed to marry during this time either. Again, it was seen that their spouse was up in the clouds, and so therefore they shouldn't marry here on Earth. But there was the tradition that when a lunar eclipse occurred, the belief that a monster was eating the moon, and that only people with albinism, the children of the moon, could go out and could kill this monster, thus saving the world. So what we see is that while there were positive myths associated with them, they were still killed at birth, prohibited from economic participation, as well as from marriage. These positive myths completely changed during the 1500s, and for about approximately 300 years when the Guna people were at war, first with the Spanish, then with the Colombians and the Panamanians. With the first ships to arrive in Gunayala in 1510, you had the onslaught of not only disease and war, but also various other tactics which served to completely demolish this culture and this community. It's approximated that about 98% of their population was killed by the colonialists, either through the disease or war. There was also the use of rape as a tool of war. So during this time, you have a community that was originally on the inside of Panama, dispersing and moving out to the islands. You have a huge loss of life, and this also means a loss of culture. People are forgetting their traditions and their history. And so some forget about the Ibegua. Some also believe that this new light-skinned child is actually a mix with a Spanish conquistador, an outsider. The term Nia was used. Nia means both ghost and foreigner. And it's also still used today sometimes to be associated with people with albinism. And so you see at this time that there are negative myths. The positive has been almost completely erased from their society. They're killed at birth now because of fear of outsiders and misunderstandings. And they're prohibited from economic participation, seen as other. And they're prohibited from marriage. Importantly, a lot of these negative stereotypes and beliefs, as well as actions against people with albinism, is documented to have occurred up until the 1970s. And so what I'm going to speak to now is how that all changed, and hopefully this can give us some hope as to what can happen in the future within countries around the world who are suffering from stigma. And so in Gunayala in the 1900s, the turn of the century, you have several key things that happened. One, you have a reclaiming of traditions by building community identities. You also have the Guna independence, or the creation of their sub-autonomous state, and the role that people with albinism played during that time. You also have internal and external forces which were there helping to stop the practice of infanticide against people with albinism, which simultaneously increased the number of people with albinism